The grand hall of the Crimson Castle was silent, except for the faint crackle of torches licking the stone walls. She stood there, trembling, eyes down, pouring wine into a golden chalice that wasn't hers to touch. The Vampire King watched her every move, every breath. He noticed it immediately, the way her sleeve slipped too quickly back into place, the faint shimmer of blood beneath pale skin. "Who bit you?" His voice was soft. The servants froze. No one dared to breathe. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. "It was nothing, my lord." But he could smell the lie. It wasn't the scent of fear, it was betrayal. He rose from his throne, shadows curling at his feet, and in that moment, every candle in the hall flickered out. Stay with me until the end, because what he did next didn't just expose a traitor, it changed the fate of the entire kingdom. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Ilara had served in the Crimson Castle for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Not that anyone was counting, except her. Every morning she woke before dawn, dressed in the simple gray uniform that marked her as property of the royal household, and made her way to the servants' quarters, where the day's assignments were handed out like death sentences. Today was different, though. Today she'd been chosen for the evening feast, the grand hall, the inner circle, the place where mortals like her weren't supposed to exist, let alone serve wine to creatures who could drain her dry without breaking a sweat. But here she was, silver tray balanced perfectly in her hands, moving between tables filled with vampires whose ages spanned centuries. Their conversations drifted over her head in languages she didn't recognize, punctuated by laughter that sounded more like breaking glass than joy. The bite marks on her wrist throbbed beneath the carefully positioned fabric of her sleeve. She'd wrapped them in linen that morning, applied the healing salve from the kitchen stores, and prayed to whatever god still listened that they wouldn't show. The puncture wounds were deep, too deep, and the bruising had spread in ugly purple blotches that no amount of powder could hide. 3 days ago, Lord Cassius had cornered her in the wine cellar. 3 days ago, her world had tilted on its axis in the worst possible way. She pushed the memory down, focusing instead on her feet moving silently across the marble floor. Don't think about it. Don't remember his hands, his voice, the way he'd smiled before his fangs found her skin. Just pour the wine. Keep your head down. Survive another day. The Vampire King's table sat elevated at the far end of the hall, a massive structure carved from black obsidian that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. King Aldrich himself was a figure of legend, ancient beyond measure, with silver hair that caught the torchlight and eyes the color of fresh blood. He rarely spoke during these gatherings, content to observe his court with the patience of someone who had all eternity to watch the world unfold. Ilara approached his table with steps measured in fear. The other servants had warned her about getting too close to the king. "He saw everything," they whispered. "Every secret, every lie, every desperate thought that crossed your mind when you thought no one was looking." She reached for his empty chalice, fingers steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The wine was a deep burgundy, imported from vineyards in the southern provinces where humans still grew grapes under vampire protection. As she poured, the liquid caught the light like liquid rubies. That's when it happened. A slight shift in her grip, a moment of weakness she couldn't control, and her sleeve slipped backward just enough to reveal the edge of the bandages beneath. King Aldrich's eyes locked onto the exposed fabric immediately. His nostrils flared slightly, and Ilara watched in horror as his expression shifted from mild disinterest to something far more dangerous. The hall didn't go quiet all at once. Instead, silence spread outward from the king's table like ripples in a pond, conversation dying as vampires sensed the change in their ruler's mood. Within moments, 300 immortal beings had turned their attention to the trembling servant girl who just made a fatal mistake. "Who bit you?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, Ilara's mouth went dry, her carefully rehearsed lies crumbling before she could speak them. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. It was, "Nothing, my lord." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were useless. Vampires could smell deception the way humans could smell smoke, and King Aldrich had been alive long enough to recognize every shade of truth and falsehood that existed. His eyes narrowed, and when he stood, every shadow in the hall seemed to reach toward him like living things. The torches flickered, their flames bending in directions that defied physics. "Show me." 2 words. That's all it took to seal her fate. Ilara's hands shook as she set down the wine pitcher. There was no refusing a direct command from the Vampire King. There was no escape, no clever deflection, no hope of walking away from this moment unchanged. She pulled back her sleeve with movements that felt like she was signing her own death warrant. The bite marks were worse than she'd thought. In the torchlight, they looked like twin craters gouged into her pale flesh, surrounded by bruising that had turned nearly black at the edges. The puncture wounds were deep enough that they hadn't fully closed, and dried blood crusted the bandages she'd wrapped around them. A collective intake of breath rippled through the hall, not because vampires were shocked by the sight of bite marks. They saw those every day, but because these particular marks told a story that no one wanted to hear. King Aldrich descended from his elevated table with movements that were too fluid to be entirely human. Each step echoed in the sudden silence, a countdown to something that felt inevitable and terrible. He stopped directly in front of Ilara, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold that radiated from his skin. When he reached out to examine her wrist, his touch was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. "These are feeding marks," he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall despite its softness. "But you are under royal protection. No one feeds from the servants without explicit permission from the crown." His thumb traced the edge of one of the wounds, and Ilara bit back a whimper. The king's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that surprised her. Not anger, not hunger, but something that looked almost like concern. "Who did this to you?" This time, there was no escaping the question. This time, her silence would be seen as defiance, and defiance meant death. Ilara's gaze darted around the hall, landing briefly on Lord Cassius, where he sat 3 tables away. His face was perfectly composed, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers gripped his wine glass just a little too tightly. She started, then stopped. Because giving up Cassius's name would mean accusations, investigations, political upheaval. It would mean admitting that one of the king's inner circle had broken sacred laws. It would mean painting a target on her back that would follow her for whatever remained of her short life. But lying to the Vampire King wasn't just dangerous. It was impossible. "Lord Cassius," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a stone into still water. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Conversations erupted across the hall as vampires turned to stare at the accused lord. Some looked shocked, others calculating, a few almost pleased at the prospect of scandal. Lord Cassius himself rose slowly from his seat, his expression shifting from composed to coldly furious. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from centuries of noble breeding, "surely you don't intend to take the word of a mere servant over that of your loyal vassal." King Aldrich didn't look away from Ilara's face. "The marks don't lie, Cassius, and neither does her blood. I can taste your signature in her veins from here." The temperature in the hall plummeted another 10 degrees. Frost began forming on the surface of wine glasses, and several oved went out entirely. "She, the torches, guttered and offered herself," Lord Cassius said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "Servants do it all the time, trading blood for favors, for protection. She came to me willingly." "Did you?" King Aldrich asked Ilara, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Ilara thought about lying. It would be easier, safer, less likely to result in the kind of political chaos that could bring the entire court crashing down around her ears. But looking into those ancient red eyes, she found she couldn't force the words past her lips. "No, my lord," she said instead. "I didn't offer. I couldn't stop him." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. King Aldric's hand was still holding her wrist, his thumb still tracing the wounds that Lord Cassius had left behind. When he finally looked up, his expression had transformed into something that made even the oldest vampires in the hall take an involuntary step backward. "Cassius," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You have violated the ancient laws of hospitality. You have taken what was not freely given from someone under my protection. You have brought dishonor to this court and to your bloodline." Lord Cassius's face went white. "Your Majesty, please, I can explain." "There is nothing to explain." King Aldric released Ilara's wrist and turned to face the accused vampire fully. "The evidence is written in blood and fear. The sentence is equally clear. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for generations to come." The shadows didn't just gather around King Aldric. They obeyed him. They rose from the corners of the hall like living smoke, pooling at his feet before spreading outward in tendrils that seemed to taste the air itself. Every vampire in the hall felt it. The ancient power that had built this kingdom, that had carved territories from human lands and bent other immortals to his will. Lord Cassius took a step backward, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Your Majesty, surely we can discuss this privately. There's no need to make a spectacle." "Silence." The word hit like a physical blow. Lord Cassius stumbled, his mouth snapping shut as if invisible hands had clamped over it. The shadows continued their advance, sliding across the marble floor with purpose. King Aldric's voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of absolute judgment. "You speak of spectacle, Cassius? You who violated sacred law in my own domain? Who took blood without consent from one under my protection?" His eyes swept the hall, taking in every face, every expression of shock and calculation. "Let this be a spectacle, then. Let every vampire in this kingdom witness what happens to those who forget their place." Ilara pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she was certain every vampire in the hall could hear it. She'd expected punishment for speaking out, expected to be silenced or worse for daring to accuse a lord of the realm. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the Vampire King to care about the wounds on her wrist, about the fear that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. The shadows reached Lord Cassius first. They wrapped around his ankles like chains, then climbed higher, binding his arms to his sides. He struggled against them, his own considerable strength meaning nothing against the ancient power that commanded them. "You want to know what I smelled when I caught her scent?" King Aldric asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Terror. Pure, undiluted terror. The kind that comes from being helpless, from knowing that no one will save you because no one cares enough to try." He moved closer to the bound vampire, each step deliberate and measured. "But there was something else, wasn't there, Cassius? Something you thought you could hide beneath the scent of blood and fear." Lord Cassius's eyes went wide. He tried to speak, but the shadows had found his throat now, pressing against his windpipe just hard enough to make breathing difficult. "Compulsion," King Aldric said, and the word fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. "You didn't just take her blood, did you? You reached into her mind first, made her compliant, made her unable to resist or cry out or flee." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Compulsion was forbidden under the old laws, a violation so severe that it carried only one punishment. Even Lord Cassius's allies, the vampires who'd stood with him through decades of political maneuvering, began backing away from his table. "That's impossible," someone whispered from the crowd. "The servants wear iron. They're protected from mental influence." King Aldric's smile was sharp as a blade. "Show them, Cassius. Show them how you circumvented protections that have stood for 3 centuries. The shadows tightened their grip, and Lord Cassius gasped, his hand flying to his throat. When he pulled it away, there was something glinting between his fingers. a small pendant, no larger than a coin, made of what looked like crystallized blood. "A compulsion amplifier," King Aldrich announced, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs. "Illegal to create, illegal to possess, and certainly illegal to use on anyone under royal protection." He turned to address the hall directly. "This device can override iron protections, can reach into a human mind and twist it to the wielder's will. It turns free choice into slavery." Ilara felt sick. She remembered that pendant now, remembered the way Lord Cassius had clutched it while he spoke to her in the wine cellar. She'd thought it was just jewelry, some family heirloom or symbol of rank. She hadn't known it was the reason she'd felt so strange, so disconnected from her own thoughts, so unable to scream or run or fight back the way every instinct told her to. "You made her want it," King Aldrich continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "You reached into her mind and convinced her that she desired what you were doing, that she was willing, that she enjoyed the pain." The shadows around Lord Cassius pulsed, tightening like a noose. "And then, when it was over, you let her remember everything. Let her live with the confusion of thinking she'd chosen her own violation." The hall erupted. Vampires were on their feet, some shouting condemnations, others demanding immediate justice. A few of Lord Cassius's remaining supporters tried to argue for clemency, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of outrage. Through it all, King Aldrich remained perfectly still, watching the chaos with ancient eyes. When he raised his hand for silence, the hall obeyed instantly. "The law is clear," he said. "Compulsion of a protected servant is punishable by final death, but this crime goes deeper than simple lawbreaking." His gaze found Ilara where she stood, pressed against the wall. "This was an attack on the foundation of our society, on the trust that allows humans to serve in our halls without fear, on the protection I have sworn to provide." He turned back to Lord Cassius, who was now struggling desperately against the shadow bonds. "You didn't just violate a servant, Cassius. You violated me. You spat on my authority and my protection. You made a mockery of everything this court stands for." The shadows began to constrict. Lord Cassius's face went purple, then gray. His struggles became more frantic, more desperate. "Please," he gasped. "Your Majesty, I beg you. I can make amends. I can compensate the girl, provide gold, lands." "Gold." King Aldrich's laugh was like breaking ice. "You think this is about gold? You think you can pay your way out of what you've done?" The shadows stopped constricting, but they didn't release their hold. Lord Cassius hung suspended above the floor, his feet kicking uselessly at empty air. "No, Cassius. This isn't about gold or lands or any material thing you could offer. This is about justice. And justice, true justice, can't be bought." But then something unexpected happened. King Aldrich looked at Ilara again, really looked at her, and his expression shifted slightly. "However," he said slowly, "justice also can't be dispensed without the consent of the wronged party." He addressed her directly, his voice gentling for the first time since this confrontation began. "Ilara, the choice is yours. Death for your attacker, as the law demands, or something else." Every vampire in the hall turned to stare at her. 300 pairs of immortal eyes, waiting for her decision. The weight of their attention was crushing, but somehow, looking into King Aldrich's blood-red gaze, she found her voice. "I don't want him to die," she said quietly. The words seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. "But I don't want him to hurt anyone else either." King, as if her answer confirmed, Aldrich nodded slowly, and something he'd already suspected. "Then we vampires in the hall, in steel, find another way, a way that ensures my protection." What he did next shocked even the oldest. He never harms another soul undered of killing Lord Cassius outright. He reached out with one pale hand and pressed it against the bound vampire's forehead. There was a flash of silver light, a sound like breaking crystal, and suddenly Lord Cassius was screaming. When the light faded, something fundamental had changed in the condemned vampire's eyes. They were empty now, vacant, like looking into a house with no one home. "I have taken his ability to compel," King Aldrich announced. His ability to influence minds, to override will, to twist thoughts to his desires. It's gone forever. He released the shadow bonds, and Lord Cassius collapsed to the floor, like a marionette with cut strings. He will live, but he will live as what he tried to make others become. A creature without the power to impose his will on anyone. The hall was silent except for Lord Cassius's quiet sobbing. He tried to stand, failed, tried again. When he finally managed to get to his feet, he looked around the hall with confused, frightened eyes. "Guards," King Aldrich commanded, "escort Lord Cassius to the border. He is banished from this kingdom forever. If he returns, if he so much as sets foot on our lands again, he dies." As the guards moved to comply, King Aldrich turned back to Alara. The shadows had retreated now, pooling back into the corners where they belonged. The torches flickered back to their normal brightness, and the supernatural cold began to lift from the hall. "Are you satisfied with this justice?" he asked her. Alara looked at Lord Cassius being led away, at his broken expression and stumbling gait. She thought about the fear she'd carried for 3 days, about the nightmares and the confusion, and the terrible sense that somehow it had all been her fault. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I think I am." King Aldrich smiled then, and for the first time since she'd known him, it looked genuinely warm. "Good, then it's done." But as the hall began to return to normal, as conversations resumed and wine was poured, and the evening's festivities continued, Alara realized that something had fundamentally changed, not just for Lord Cassius, not just for the court's understanding of their king's justice, but for her. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer invisible. Every vampire in the hall now knew her name, her face, her story. But more than that, they knew their king had chosen to protect her. And in the complex web of vampire politics, that protection meant everything. As the evening wore on, Alara noticed the changes immediately. Other servants who had barely acknowledged her existence now nodded respectfully when they passed. Lord Theron, who commanded the Eastern Territories, actually stepped aside to let her refill his wineglass without the usual dismissive wave. Lady Morgana, known for her cruelty toward human staff, offered what might have been the ghost of a smile. But it wasn't just respect she saw in their eyes. It was curiosity, and perhaps something more dangerous than Lord Cassius had ever been: interest. King Aldrich returned to his obsidian throne, but his attention never strayed far from where Alara moved through the hall. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight, protective, but also calculating. She'd become something new in his court. Not quite servant, not quite guest, but something that existed in the space between. The feast continued until the early hours of dawn, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Conversations were more subdued, GL recalibrating their answers more careful. Everyone was understanding of their king's priorities, of what lines could and couldn't be crossed. When the last guests finally departed and the servants began cleaning the great hall, King Aldrich remained on his throne, watching the organized chaos of restoration. Alara found herself cleaning tables near the royal dais, close enough that normal conversation would carry between them. "You're afraid," he said suddenly, not looking at her directly. She paused in her work, a silver goblet half cleaned in her hands. "Yes, my lord." "Of me?" The question hung in the air between them. Alara considered lying, considered the safe answer that would keep her in the shadows where she'd lived for 3 years. Instead, she found herself speaking truth. "Not of you directly, my lord, but of what comes next, of what happens when someone like me becomes visible in a place like this." King Aldrich's lips curved in what might have been approval. "You understand the game better than most who were born to it." He finally turned to look at her directly. "You're right to be afraid. What happened tonight has consequences. For you, for the court, for the delicate balance that keeps this kingdom stable." Alara set down the goblet, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Then why did you do it? Why not let Lord Cassius face quiet justice? Why make it a spectacle?" Because quiet justice isn't justice at all when the crime is public humiliation and violation. His red eyes glowed in the torchlight. Because every human in this castle needed to see that my protection means something. And because every vampire in this kingdom needed to remember that power comes with responsibility. He rose from his throne and descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the mostly empty hall. But you're asking the wrong question, Alara. What should I be asking, my lord? You should be asking what happens to you now, because you can't go back to being invisible. Not after tonight. The other houses will hear about this within days. Some will see you as a symbol of my weakness, proof that I value human comfort over vampire tradition. Others will see you as a tool to be used against me. The words sent ice through her veins. She'd been so focused on Lord Cassius and his punishment that she hadn't considered the larger implications. In saving her from one predator, King Aldrich might have exposed her to dozens of others. Are you saying I should leave, my lord? I'm saying you need to decide what you want to be. You can remain a servant, but you'll be a marked one. Every interaction will be scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every moment of weakness exploited by those who want to prove that protecting humans is a luxury this kingdom can't afford. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that his gaze, she had to tilt her head back to meet, become something else entirely. What else could I become? King Aldrich smiled, and this time there was something predatory in it, but not threatening. More like a hunter recognizing potential prey that might surprise him. That depends entirely on how much courage you actually possess. Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps echoed from the hall's entrance. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the fluid grace that marked all of this inner king's circle. Lady Seraphina, the court one of the few vamps spy master Anirez who seemed to exist outside the normal political hierarchies. Your Majesty, she said, offering a respectful bow. Lord Cassius has been escorted to the border as ordered, but there have been developments. King Aldrich's expression shifted to business immediately. Speak. 3 ravens arrived during the night. The northern houses are calling for an emergency council session. They're claiming that tonight's events represent a fundamental shift in kingdom policy that requires formal review. Lady Seraphina's gaze flicked briefly to Alara. They're also requesting that the human in question be present for testimony. Alara felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. An emergency council session meant every major vampire house would send representatives. It meant days of formal proceedings, political maneuvering, and testimony that could reshape the kingdom's laws regarding human servants. It also meant she would be the center of attention for some of the most powerful and dangerous immortals in existence. How long do we have? King Aldrich asked. They're invoking the ancient right of urgent assembly. 7 days, my lord. The Aldrich council convenes whether you attend or not. King quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through implications and strategies. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute decision. Then we have 7 days to prepare. 7 days to ensure that when Alara stands before the council, she does so not as a victim seeking justice, but as someone who belongs in that hall. Lady Seraphina raised an eyebrow. My lord, the northern houses want to make this about human fragility and vampire strength. They want to argue that protecting servants weakens our position, makes us soft. His smile was sharp as winter. Instead, we're going to show them exactly how strong protection can make someone. He turned to Alara, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse race. Not hunger, not threat, but possibility. 7 days, Alara. 7 days to transform from servant to something that can stand in a room full of ancient vampires and not just survive, but thrive. He paused. 7 days to decide if you trust me enough to let me teach you what you'll need to know. Alara looked around the great hall, at the tables where she'd served wine for 3 years, at the shadows where she'd tried to remain invisible, at the throne where King Aldrich had dispensed justice on her behalf. She thought about Lord Cassius and his compulsion pendant, about the fear she'd carried, and the nightmares that still woke her in the depths of sleep. She thought about spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next predator to decide she was easy prey. "What would you teach me, my lord?" "Everything. Politics, protocol, the art of reading vampire expressions and interpreting the spaces between words. How to move through dangerous rooms without making yourself a target. How to speak with authority even when you feel like you're drowning." His eyes glowed brighter. "How to be someone who belongs in places where humans aren't supposed to exist. And if I fail, if I can't learn fast enough or well enough, then you'll face the council as you are now, and we'll deal with whatever consequences arise. But I don't think you'll fail, Ilara. You survived 3 years in Lord Cassius's reach without breaking. You spoke truth to power when it would have been safer to lie. You chose mercy when vengeance was expected." He extended one pale hand. "I think you're stronger than either of us knows." Ilara stared at the offered hand. Taking it would mean stepping completely out of the life she'd known, abandoning the safety of invisibility for something far more dangerous and uncertain. It would mean trusting a vampire king with not just her life, but her future. But staying in the shadows wasn't safety anymore. Tonight had proven that. The shadows were just another kind of prison. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His skin was cold as marble, but his grip was gentle, careful not to use the strength that could crush her bones without effort. 7 days then, my lord." 7 days, he agreed. "But first, you need to understand something fundamental about what you've agreed to." His grip tightened slightly, not painful but firm enough to ensure she was listening. "The moment you walk into that council chamber, you won't just be representing yourself. You'll be representing the idea that humans deserve protection, that strength can be measured in something other than fangs and centuries. You'll be representing my judgment, my authority, my vision of what this kingdom should be." The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead cloak. "That's a lot to carry, my lord." "Yes, it is, but you won't be carrying it alone." He released her hand and stepped back. "Lady Seraphina will begin your education tomorrow at sunset. You'll learn court protocol, vampire history, the political undercurrents that drive every decision in this kingdom. You'll understand not just what to say, but how to say it, when to speak, and when silence is more powerful than words." Lady Seraphina nodded, though her expression suggested she found the entire situation both fascinating and potentially catastrophic. "It will be intensive, my lord. 7 days isn't much time to master what most vampires spend decades learning. Then we'll have to be creative with our teaching methods." King Aldrich's smile was sharp, "and Ilara will have to be an exceptional student." As if summoned by the conversation, more footsteps echoed from the hall's entrance. This time it was Marcus, the head of the king's personal guard, accompanied by 2 younger vampires Ilara didn't recognize. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, offering a formal bow. "The perimeter is secure, but we've detected increased activity from several directions. It seems word of tonight's events is spreading faster than anticipated." King Aldrich nodded grimly. "Expected. How many houses have sent scouts?" "At least 4, possibly more. They're maintaining respectful distances, but they're definitely gathering intelligence." Marcus's gaze flicked to Ilara. "They're particularly interested in the humans' movements and associations. Then we adjust our timeline. Ilara's education begins now, not tomorrow." King Aldrich turned to address the small group that had gathered. "Marcus, I want discreet but visible protection around her at all times. Not obvious enough to suggest weakness, but clear enough that anyone considering direct action understands the consequences." "Understood, my lord." "Lady Seraphina, you'll need to compress 7 days of instruction into perhaps 4. Focus on essentials: political awareness, threat recognition, and most importantly, how to project confidence even when terrified." "It can be done, my lord, though it won't be pleasant for anyone involved." King Aldrich's attention returned to Ilara, who was beginning to understand that her quiet life of invisible service had just exploded into something far more complex and dangerous. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. Ilara considered the question seriously. She thought about the wine cellar and Lord Cassius's pendant. She thought about 3 years of carefully avoiding attention, of making herself small and unremarkable, and safe. She thought about the alternative that awaited her if she chose to remain what she had always been. No, my lord. No second thoughts. But I do have a question. Ask it. Why me? Why risk political upheaval and potential conflict with other houses for one human servant? There are dozens of others in this castle who've faced similar situations. Why make me the symbol of your protection? King Aldrich was quiet for so long that Alara began to wonder if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried centuries of weariness and something that might have been hope. Because you asked the right question. Tonight, when I offered you Lord Cassius's death, you didn't ask for revenge. You asked that he not be allowed to hurt anyone else. In 4.5 centuries of existence, I've seen thousands of humans face injustice. Most want blood, some want gold. A few want nothing but to forget. His red eyes met hers. You wanted protection for people you'd never met, people who might suffer what you suffered. That kind of thinking, that ability to see beyond personal pain to systemic problems, is exactly what this kingdom needs. He paused, then added more softly, and perhaps it's what I need as well. The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything that had passed between king and servant before. Alara realized that this wasn't just about her education or the emergency council session. This was about King Aldrich testing an idea, exploring whether the rigid hierarchies that had governed vampire society for millennia could evolve into something more complex and perhaps more just. She was about to become the experiment that would determine whether that evolution was possible. Then we'd better make sure I don't disappoint you, my lord. King Aldrich's smile was genuine this time, warm and almost human. Something tells me disappointment is the least of our concerns. As dawn approached, and the great hall finally emptied of all but the king's inner circle, Ilara found herself standing at the center of a transformation that would echo through the kingdom for generations to come. 7 days to learn what vampires spent decades mastering. 7 days to become someone who could stand before the most powerful immortals in existence and represent not just herself, but an entirely new vision of what their society could become. 7 days to prove that protection and strength weren't mutually exclusive, but rather two sides of the same coin. The education of Ilara was about to begin, and with it, the future of the kingdom itself would be decided. The first lesson began before the sun had fully set. Ilara found herself in King Aldrich's private study, a chamber she'd never imagined existed, let alone thought she'd ever enter. The walls were lined with books that looked older than kingdoms, their leather spines cracked with age and secrets. Candles floated without holders, their flames dancing in patterns that defied natural law. Lady Seraphina stood behind an ornate desk, her silver hair pulled back in a severe knot that made her cheekbones look sharp enough to cut glass. She'd changed from her court attire into something more practical, though on her, practical still meant silk and midnight blue fabric that probably cost more than most humans saw in a lifetime. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a chair that had been positioned directly across from her. "We have 4 days to accomplish what should take 4 decades. There's no time for gentle introductions or gradual learning curves." Ilara sat, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The chair was comfortable, too comfortable for someone who'd spent 3 years standing through every interaction with vampire nobility. "First lesson," Lady Seraphina began, pulling out a leather journal and setting it on the desk with deliberate precision. "Forget everything you think you know about your place in this world. As of last night, you became something unprecedented. Not human, not vampire, but something that exists in the space between. The Council will try to categorize you, to fit you into boxes they understand. Your survival depends on refusing to be contained." She opened the journal, revealing pages covered in elegant script and detailed diagrams. "These are the major houses that will be represented at the emergency session Black. House Thorne controls the Northern Territories and commands the largest military force outside the capital. Lord Blackthorne is ancient, proud, and believes humans exist solely to serve vampire interests. He'll see you as an insult to the natural order. Lady Seraphina turned the page, revealing a portrait of a severe-looking vampire with ice-blue eyes. House Ravencrest oversees trade relations with human settlements. Lady Ravencrest is more progressive than Blackthorne, but she's also practical to a fault. She'll support whatever position benefits her financially. If she can be convinced that protecting humans improves trade relationships, she might become an ally. More pages, more portraits, more names and histories and political positions that Alara tried desperately to memorize. House Shadowmere, who controlled the kingdom's spy networks and would already know more about her than she knew about herself. House Ironhold, master craftsman who supplied weapons and armor to the royal guard. House Nightfall, scholars and historians who would dissect every precedent and legal interpretation. Each house will have their own agenda, Lady Seraphina continued, her voice never varying from its crisp, instructional tone. But they'll all be united in one thing. They want to know if King Aldrich's protection of you represents a fundamental shift in policy, or if you're simply an anomaly that can be contained and forgotten. Alara's head was already spinning with names and alliances and political undercurrents she'd never had to consider. How am I supposed to convince them that protecting humans is beneficial when I don't even understand vampire politics? You're asking the wrong question. Lady Seraphina's smile was sharp as broken glass. You don't need to convince them of anything. You need to make them believe that you belong in that room, that your presence is natural and inevitable rather than revolutionary. She stood and began pacing behind the desk, her movements fluid and controlled. Vampires respect strength above all else. Not just physical strength, though that matters, but strength of will, of purpose, of conviction. They need to see that you're not a victim who got lucky, but someone who earned their place through courage and intelligence. But I am a victim who got lucky. No. Lady Seraphina stopped pacing and fixed Alara with a stare that felt like being examined under a microscope. You're a survivor who recognized an opportunity and had the courage to seize it. You didn't just endure Lord Cassius's violation. You found a way to expose him that led to justice. You didn't just accept the king's protection. You shaped how that protection was administered. There's a difference, and that difference is what will keep you alive in 4 days. The lesson continued for hours. Lady Seraphina drilled Alara on proper forms of address for different ranks of vampire nobility, on how to read the subtle body language that conveyed threat or alliance, on the intricate dance of court politics where a misplaced word could start wars and a well-timed silence could end them. When Lord Blackthorne speaks, he'll try to intimidate you with his age and authority, Lady Seraphina explained, pulling out a new set of documents. He's over 800 years old and has commanded armies in dozens of campaigns. He'll expect you to cower, to defer, to acknowledge your inferior status through your posture and tone. And if I do, then you confirm everything he believes about human weakness, and the council will vote to revoke the king's protection policies within the hour. Lady Seraphina's expression was grim. But if you stand too tall, if you meet his authority with defiance, he'll see that as proof that humans can't be trusted with any measure of power. Alara felt trapped between impossible choices. Then what do I do? You show respect without submission. You acknowledge his experience without accepting inferiority. You demonstrate that strength and humility can coexist. Lady Seraphina moved to stand directly in front of Ilara's chair. Show me. I'm Lord Blackthorne, and I've just questioned your right to speak in the council chamber. Alara tried to imagine herself facing an 800-year-old vampire lord who considered her less than human. Her first instinct was to look down, to make herself small and non-threatening, but Lady Seraphina's earlier words echoed in her mind. Strength of will, strength of conviction. She raised her eyes to meet Lady Seraphina's gaze directly, but kept her expression open rather than challenging. My lord, I speak not from right, but from responsibility. The king has asked me to share my experience so that the council might make informed decisions about the welfare of those under royal protection. Lady Seraphina nodded slowly. Better. You acknowledged his authority while asserting your purpose, but your voice was too soft, too hesitant. In vampire culture, uncertainty is seen as weakness, and weakness invites attack. They practiced the exchange again and again. Each time, Lady Seraphina found new flaws to correct, new subtleties to master. The way Alara held her hands spoke to her comfort level. The rhythm of her breathing indicated confidence or fear. Even the direction of her gaze carried meaning in the complex language of vampire social interaction. Remember, Lady Seraphina said, as the lesson stretched into its fourth hour, you're not just representing yourself in that chamber. You're representing the possibility that humans and vampires can coexist as something more than predator and prey. Every vampire in that room will be watching for signs that this possibility is worth exploring or dangerous enough to crush before it spreads. By the time King Aldrich arrived to observe the lesson's progress, Alara felt like her head might explode from the sheer volume of information she was trying to absorb. Rules of precedence, historical context, political alliances that shifted based on everything from territorial disputes to personal grievances that stretched back centuries. How is she progressing? The king asked, settling into a chair that materialized from the shadows as if it had been waiting for him. She learns quickly, Lady Seraphina admitted, though her tone suggested this was barely adequate given the circumstances. Her instincts are good. She understands that survival depends on reading the room and adapting her approach accordingly. But 4 days isn't enough time to develop the kind of presence that commands automatic respect. King Aldrich studied Alara with those ancient red eyes, and she felt like he was seeing things about her that she didn't even know existed. Show me what you've learned. For the next hour, Alara demonstrated everything Lady Seraphina had taught her. How to enter a room full of vampires without appearing either submissive or threatening. How to respond to direct challenges without escalating to conflict. How to use silence as effectively as speech, and when each was appropriate. King Aldrich watched it all without comment, his expression unreadable. When the demonstration concluded, he was quiet for so long that Alara began to worry she'd failed some crucial test. "You're thinking too much," he said finally. "Every response is calculated, every gesture deliberate. It's technically correct, but it lacks authenticity. The council will see through performed confidence immediately." Alara's heart sank. After hours of intensive instruction, she was still falling short of what would be required to survive the emergency session. "However," King Aldrich continued, rising from his chair with fluid grace, "I think we've been approaching this backwards. Instead of teaching you to act like you belong in that chamber, perhaps we should focus on helping you understand why you actually do belong there." He moved to stand beside Lady Seraphina, and together they looked like the embodiment of vampire nobility. Ancient, powerful, perfectly controlled. Everything Alara would never be. "Tell me about your family," King Aldrich said suddenly. The request caught Alara completely off guard. "My lord, your family, your life before you came to serve in this castle. I know you were born in the eastern provinces, that you arrived here 3 years ago seeking employment, but I don't know what brought you to my door. What circumstances led a young woman to leave everything familiar for service in a vampire court?" Alara hesitated. Her past wasn't something she'd ever discussed with anyone in the castle. It was easier to let people assume she was just another human seeking better opportunities in the capital. "My village was attacked by rogue vampires," she said quietly. "Not your subjects, my lord. Outcasts who fed without permission and killed without purpose. They burned our crops, slaughtered our livestock, terrorized families for sport." King Aldrich's expression hardened. "Go on." "The local lord was supposed to protect us, but he was in debt to House Shadowmere and couldn't risk offending them by requesting military assistance. So we were abandoned, left to face creatures we had no hope of defeating." Ilara's voice grew stronger as the memories surfaced. "I lost my parents, my younger brother, most of the people I'd grown up with. The survivors scattered to other settlements or came to the capital seeking work. And you chose to serve in a vampire court, despite having every reason to hate our kind. It wasn't a question, but Alara answered anyway. I chose to serve here because I learned the difference between vampires who follow laws and those who don't. Because I believed that structure and accountability could prevent what happened to my village from happening to others. King Aldrich exchanged a look with Lady Seraphina, and Alara caught something passing between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of something she'd unknowingly revealed. That's why you belong in that council chamber, King Aldrich said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Not because you've learned to mimic vampire mannerisms or memorized political protocols, but because you understand something that many of my subjects have forgotten. The difference between power and responsibility, between strength and cruelty. He returned to his chair, but his attention never wavered from Alara's face. The council thinks they're debating whether humans deserve protection. What they're actually debating is whether vampire society has grown so comfortable with dominance that we've forgotten why we established laws in the first place. Lady Seraphina nodded slowly. The king is right. Your technical knowledge of court protocol matters, but it's secondary to your understanding of why that protocol exists. You've lived on both sides of vampire protection. You know what happens when it fails and what's possible when it succeeds. Alara felt something shift inside her chest. Not confidence exactly, but a growing understanding of her role in the larger conflict. She wasn't just defending her right to royal protection. She was representing the possibility that vampire power could be used to create rather than destroy, to protect rather than exploit. The other houses will test you, King Aldrich continued. They'll push to see if you break under pressure, if you revert to the frightened servant girl who spilled wine on noble tables. When that happens, and it will happen, remember why you're there. Remember your village. Remember your family. Remember that you're speaking for everyone who can't speak for themselves. The lesson continued until dawn, but the focus had shifted from performance to purpose. Instead of rehearsing scripted responses, Alara found herself exploring her own convictions, articulating beliefs she'd never had to defend before. By the time Lady Seraphina finally dismissed her to rest, Alara felt fundamentally changed. Not stronger exactly, but clearer about what she was fighting for and why that fight mattered. 3 days remained until the emergency council session. 3 days to refine her understanding and prepare for a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the future relationship between vampires and the humans under their protection. As she made her way through the castle corridors toward her quarters, Alara realized that she was no longer afraid of failing the king's expectations. She was afraid of failing the memory of everyone who died because protection had been denied when it was needed most. That fear, she was beginning to understand, might be exactly the strength she needed to survive what was coming. The second day brought challenges Alara hadn't anticipated. She woke to find Marcus, the head of the king's guard, waiting outside her quarters with 2 younger vampires she'd never seen before. Their presence wasn't threatening exactly, but it was unmistakably protective in a way that made every other servant in the corridor stop and stare. "Lady Alara," Marcus said, the title catching her completely off guard. "The king has requested your presence in the training yards." Training yards. Alara had never been anywhere near the castle's military facilities. Servants weren't permitted in areas where vampires honed their supernatural abilities, where ancient weapons were tested against immortal reflexes. The walk through the castle revealed just how much had changed overnight. Servants who'd never acknowledged her existence now offered respectful nods. Kitchen staff stepped aside to let her pass. Even the head housekeeper, a stern woman who'd terrified Alara for 3 years, managed something that might have been a curtsy. Word had spread, not just about Lord Cassius and his banishment, but about King Aldrich's unprecedented decision to personally oversee her education. In the complex hierarchy of vampire society, That level of royal attention elevated her status far beyond anything she'd imagined possible. The training yards occupied a vast courtyard behind the castle's main structure, surrounded by high walls carved with protective symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Weapons racks lined the perimeter, displaying everything from traditional swords and crossbows to devices Ilara couldn't begin to identify. King Aldrich stood at the center of the space, no longer wearing his formal court attire. Instead, he donned simple black clothing that emphasized the predatory grace of his movements. He was sparring with a vampire Ilara recognized as Captain Thane, the king's personal combat instructor. The speed of their engagement was impossible to follow with human eyes. They moved like liquid shadow, their blades meeting in showers of sparks that should have been blinding, but somehow weren't. The sound of metal striking metal rang across the courtyard, in rhythms too complex for mortal ears to parse. When King Aldrich noticed her arrival, he raised his hand, and the sparring match ended instantly. Captain Thane stepped back with a respectful bow, though his eyes lingered on Ilara with undisguised curiosity. "You're wondering why I brought you here," King Aldrich said, approaching with a sword still in his hand. The blade was beautiful, silver-white metal that seemed to drink in the morning light. "Yes, my lord. I assumed my education would continue with Lady Seraphina. It will. But first, you need to understand something fundamental about vampire culture that can't be learned from books or political instruction." He gestured toward the weapons displays surrounding them. "We are, at our core, a martial society. Strength isn't just respected here. It's the foundation upon which all other values rest." Ilara looked around the training yard, at the scars carved into stone walls by centuries of supernatural combat, at weapons designed to kill creatures that were already technically dead. "My lord, I'm human. I can't match vampire strength or speed." "No, you can't. But strength isn't just about physical power, and combat isn't just about winning through force." King Aldrich moved to one of the weapon racks, selecting what looked like a simple wooden staff. "The council will challenge you in ways that have nothing to do with formal debate. They'll test your resolve, your ability to stand firm under pressure that would break most mortals." He tossed the staff to her, and she caught it awkwardly, nearly dropping it in her surprise. "My lord, I don't understand. Show me how you'd defend yourself if someone tried to grab you." The request was so unexpected that Ilara almost laughed. Defend herself? Against vampires? The idea was absurd. "My lord, respectfully, there's no way I could defend against a vampire attack." "Against a vampire, no. But not every threat you'll face in the coming days will be supernatural." King Aldrich's expression grew serious. "The council session will attract attention from multiple factions. Human servants loyal to various houses, mortal dignitaries, even representatives from hunter organizations who want to observe the proceedings. Some of them may see you as a target worth eliminating before you can testify." The possibility hadn't occurred to her, but it made sense. If her testimony could shift vampire policy regarding human protection, there were certainly mortals who would benefit from silencing her permanently. "I've never learned to fight, my lord. In my village, we relied on hiding or running when threatened. Then we'll start with the basics." "Captain Thane?" The combat instructor stepped forward, his movements fluid despite his obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, training a human in combat techniques is unprecedented. So is everything else about this situation. Show her how to use that staff to create distance between herself and an attacker." What followed was the most physically demanding hour of Ilara's life. Captain Thane, despite his reservations, proved to be a patient instructor. He showed her how to hold the staff for maximum leverage, how to use it to block incoming attacks, how to strike at vulnerable points that might give her a few seconds to escape. "Remember," he said, adjusting her grip for the dozenth time, "you're not trying to win a fight. You're trying to survive long enough for help to arrive or to reach safety. Every technique I'm showing you is designed to buy you time, not to defeat an opponent." Ilara's arms ached. Her hands were blistered from gripping the unfamiliar weapon, and sweat stung her eyes despite the cool morning air. But something was happening that she hadn't expected. With each successful block, each properly executed strike against the practice dummy, she felt a growing sense of competence. Not confidence exactly, but the knowledge that she wasn't entirely helpless, that even faced with superior strength or numbers, she had options beyond cowering and hoping for mercy. King Aldrich watched the entire session without comment, his red eyes tracking every movement, every improvement in her form. When Captain Thane finally called a halt to the training, the king approached, with what might have been approval in his expression. "How do you feel?" he asked. Ilara considered the question seriously. Her body hurt in places she'd forgotten existed, but there was something else. A sense of capability she'd never experienced before. "Different, my lord. Not stronger exactly, but less fragile." "Good. That's the beginning of what you'll need in 3 days." He took the staff from her hands, examining the places where her grip had worn away the wood's smooth finish. "Physical combat is only a small part of what we're preparing you for, but it's important that you understand your own capacity for resistance, my lord. The council will try to intimidate you through presence and authority. They'll use their age, their power, their centuries of experience to make you feel small and insignificant." King Aldrich set the staff aside and met her gaze directly. "But now you know something you didn't know an hour ago. You can learn to defend yourself. You can adapt to challenges you never imagined facing. That knowledge changes how you carry yourself, how you respond to threats." He was right. Even exhausted and aching, Ilara felt different than she had that morning. Not invulnerable, but no longer purely victim. "The real lesson here isn't about staff work or combat techniques," King Aldrich continued. "It's about discovering that you're capable of more than you believed possible. That revelation, that expansion of your understanding of your own potential, is what will carry you through the council session." As they walked back toward the castle, Ilara noticed that the vampires they encountered looked at her differently now. Word of the training session had already spread, as everything seemed to in the court's complex network of gossip and observation. Where before she'd seen curiosity or political calculation in their expressions, now she detected something that might have been respect. Not the automatic deference due to superior strength or supernatural ability, but recognition of someone who was actively working to rise to the challenges placed before her. Lady Seraphina met them at the castle's entrance, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. "How did the physical training progress?" "Better than expected," King Aldrich replied. "She learns quickly and doesn't give up when faced with difficulty. Both useful traits for what's coming." "Good, because we have new intelligence about the council session." Lady Seraphina's expression was grim. "House Blackthorn has requested additional security measures. They're claiming concerns about human infiltrators disrupting the proceedings." King Aldrich stopped walking. "What kind of security measures?" "Magical binding circles around the testimony area. Truth compulsions for all non-vampire witnesses. Essentially, they want to ensure that any human who speaks before the council does so under supernatural coercion that prevents deception." Ilara felt ice form in her stomach. "That would mean I couldn't control what I say. They could force me to reveal anything they wanted to know." "Exactly. And given your experiences with compulsion, it would also be deeply traumatic." King Aldrich's voice carried the promise of violence. "House Blackthorn is trying to ensure that your testimony works against you regardless of its content. Can you refuse their request?" "I can try, but they're invoking ancient security protocols that predate my rule. If the majority of houses agree that the threat level justifies extraordinary measures, I'll be forced to comply or risk a challenge to my authority that goes far beyond this emergency session." Lady Seraphina pulled out her ever-present journal, flipping to a page covered in fresh notes. "However, there might be an alternative. The security protocols include an exemption for individuals who can demonstrate resistance to supernatural compulsion through natural ability rather than magical protection." "Ilara resisted Lord Cassius's compulsion pendant," King Aldrich said slowly. and she broke free from the attempts during her first night before the court. If we can prove that her resistance is consistent and reliable, she could testify without being subject to truth compulsions. But proving it would require testing her against some of the most powerful mental influences in the kingdom. Ilara understood the implications immediately. To avoid being forcibly compelled during her testimony, she would need to demonstrate her resistance by facing compulsion attempts from vampires far more skilled than Lord Cassius had been. How dangerous would the testing be? Lady Seraphina and King Aldrich exchanged glances. Potentially very, Lady Seraphina admitted. Compulsion resistance isn't well understood, even among vampires. We don't know if your ability has limits, if it can be overwhelmed by sufficient force, or if repeated testing might damage your natural defenses. But without the testing, I'll be subject to truth compulsions that could force me to say anything the council wants to hear. Yes, Ilara thought about her conversation with King Aldrich the previous night, about representing not just herself but the possibility of a different relationship between vampires and humans, about her village and the people who died because protection had been denied when they needed it most. When would the testing take place? Tomorrow night. We'd need to document the results and submit them to the council before the emergency session. King Aldrich's expression was carefully neutral, giving her space to make the decision without pressure. And who would conduct the tests? And so Ilara stood at the crossroads of two worlds, no longer the invisible servant who'd poured wine in trembling silence, but something entirely new. The Vampire King had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, transforming a moment of terror into the foundation of justice that would reshape his kingdom forever. What started with bite marks hidden beneath a sleeve became a revolution in how power protects the powerless. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes a king's true strength is measured not by who he can destroy, but by who he chooses to save.